we can.
Right, perfect. So thank you for the introduction. Yeah, as you said, this is part of my final year of my fashion knitwear design degree, and this presentation is based on the paper that I wrote. And before I started, I just wanted to say thank you to my tutors at NTU, Kevin, Amy, and Peter, who all helped me so much with my final year work and with bringing together this presentation. So as you can see, my presentation is about the dress of the far right, which obviously is a really big topic. But what I'm going to discuss is a couple of historical far right groups, and then I'll present my own analysis of the dress of current day far right groups, particularly the US Capitol rioters and clothing sold on far right stores, online stores. So where my research really started was looking at the futurists, the Italian futurists. The futurist style was heavily influenced by Giacomo Balla's fascist beliefs, who is often referred to as the father of futurism. And as you can tell from this quote I've taken from Emily Brown's research, the futurists had a very literal way of interpreting fascist beliefs into fashion and design. So for example, they would talk about we're going to have a bright, exciting future, and they would use bright colors, very, very literal. And they would talk about dynamic, fast-paced, changing world, and then they would use dynamic clothes, so it was very, very literal. There's also a key theme of they encapsulate really key modernism is really key to their designs, and there's also nationalism. Italian nationalism is key throughout, and an encouragement to the Italian people to join the war, and they use the colours of the Italian flag pretty often as well, and it really does represent the kind of belief that they had of a cultural and racial superiority. So of course, another place which had extremely far-right beliefs was early 20th century Germany. Throughout this slide, I'll refer to Gunther, 2004, who found that nationalism was again really key to dress choice, especially at the end of World War I. Especially French fashion was really despised for being trashy. Although, because so much of fashion did come from France, many Germans still privately bought French fashion, but outwardly would despise it. Later, leading up to World War II, the Nazi propaganda began to kind of hone in and manipulate these anti-French beliefs by suggesting that it was somehow Jewish people who were to blame for the apparent problems within French fashion, which led to a really horrifically violent anti-Semitic campaign to remove Jewish people from the fashion industry. And since Jewish people made up so much of a large part of the fashion industry in Germany at that time, there really isn't as much to analyze in terms of fashion development. And also because of the poverty and the war that followed, there's not so much like high fashion to analyze. But where we can see a really clear kind of uniform of fascist Germany is in the actual literal uniforms that the soldiers and the Hitler youth children wore. As I'm sure you can see from this image and from this reference to Cater that I've got here, the uniforms had a very sleek sort of modern look, which just like the futurists pointed to a very modern and elite future. This kind of narrative that the Nazi party were trying to put across, that they were at the forefront of social innovation and they were creating an elite society, was all kind of displayed by having these really modern, really fashionable clothes, which would have given the soldiers a good status, despite the fact that the actual people living in Germany back home, even the people who weren't being oppressed, were still living in a lot of poverty. So now I can go on to the main area which I researched, which is current far-right groups. starting with the US Capitol riots, which happened earlier this year, which I'm sure most of you will already know a lot about what happened at this riot, but I'll just go over it quickly. So the riot was formed mostly of supporters of the departing Republican US President Donald Trump. Trump basically made inflammatory statements and making unproven claims of voter fraud, encouraging his supporters to attack the US Capitol building when what seems to have been in an attempt to impede or to protest the certification of the results of the presidential election, which he'd recently lost. And the rioters are to confirm to have included members of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, who are widely recognized as far-right white supremacist groups. As you can see in these images, the dress of the rioters is very sort of scruffy or more casual. There's also a lot of references to kind of military apparel or like survivalist clothing. As you can see in figure 3, you have the military vest. In figure 4, there's a man with the references to World War II on his t-shirt, and then in figure 5, it's kind of obscured by his hair, but the man has a gun on his hoodie, and then of course the Viking kind of war outfit, which I'll go on to talk about more later. So looking at Bernard's 2002's theories of nonverbal communication through dress, he discussed the levels of formality in dress. And if you looked at this in a certain way, this dress choice could be interpreted as kind of a protest against the government building. So most people who go into the Capitol building are going to be politicians and diplomats who will be wearing suits and formal business wear, which is really completely different to what the rioters are wearing here. So if you were just looking at these pictures without knowing the background to it, and you didn't notice or understand the racist sort of statements and symbols being made, it would be really easy to see these rioters as like an oppressed group who are living in poverty and rising up against a really elitist bourgeois government. But the problem with that argument is that we know that the protesters are actively arguing for a non-democratic state and arguably a fascist state. They're arguing against democratic voting and against the rights of minority groups, which can be evidenced from, you know, the Confederate flag and that we know there are links to white supremacist groups. Therefore, making the argument that the rioters are fighting against their own oppression it doesn't really make sense. It's quite an illogical argument. So it really makes me question whether the members of this group are deliberately putting on this kind of facade and appearance of oppression, or whether they genuinely believe that they are an oppressed group. As much as I've researched it, I can't fully know what's going inside people's heads and what messages they're seeing. But the conclusion I've come to is that there's probably a bit of both going on here. I think some people in these groups will know that the people in the groups are not really the ones who face oppression in America today, but I think they have purposely created this image that plays into oppression. However, there will be some people who are struggling for whatever reason and feel that these far-right groups represent their more radical beliefs, and they will genuinely believe that they are oppressed and take massive risks like storming the Capitol building and making these bold statements because they genuinely believe that's true. So another place which where we can see far-right clothing is in far-right clothing stores, which, to be honest, I was really shocked to find out about. This one, Thorsteiner, it brands itself as a Nordic clothing company, but it is based in Dubai. Their garments and website feature far-right and white supremacist slogans and messages. Looking at the image in figure 6, there's so much in the styling of this image from the catalogue that conveys a kind of oppression, working class, downtrodden man in this image. Despite that the hoodie being advertised costs around about €85, so it's not cheap. The graffiti, the abandoned car park with the crumbling walls, the black and white effect, they work really hard to convey this kind of oppression. Also, a lot of the clothes sold are kind of taken from like working clothes, like blue collar jobs and things like that. So on top of that, both images have this kind of Nordic typography. And obviously the Thor, a reference to the Viking god. You have this kind of Latin as well. And they all seem to be referencing Vikings, similar to the Viking outfit we saw in the last slide. This seems to be something that's really common among the far right, and particularly among white supremacist groups. And it is a bit of a confusing one because we know from history experts and people who've studied Vikings, such as Kim 2019, who I referenced, that Vikings were not all white. There were Vikings of many different races and different cultures. However, there seems to be this kind of fantasy among white supremacist groups of a Viking struggle and a pure lineage that, and a direct link of a lineage to the Vikings with blonde hair and blue eyes, which links back to the Aryan race ideas of Nazi Germany. But again, it is quite a confusing ideal because it is not actually how the Vikings were, which makes it kind of confusing to analyze. But what is really clear is that there's again this feeling of oppression, whether that's the imagined historical oppression of this sort of fantasy race of Vikings, or the oppression that we've seen that they think is happening in modern day America. So this is all very different from far-right groups 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, the far-right generally represented themselves as elite, and it was all about being superior culturally and racially, just an elite group. Whereas now the far right still definitely have these beliefs of being racially elite. However, there's this belief that their race and culture, and even possibly their possibly not real Viking lineage, is being attacked. It's very interesting to see this shift. The far right of today seems to really engage with a victim mentality. But in my opinion, this makes these groups really dangerous because it's really a foundation of misinformation, and that so easily leads to more and more misinformation. Just in this presentation, I've pointed out so many ideologies of the far right that are just clearly very flawed, just at a basic level. From things like the confusion about the race and Vikings, which you could just, they could just look up on their phone and find out it's not true, all the way to the horrific attitudes towards Jewish people that were fabricated by the Nazi Party in Germany, which obviously caused horrible atrocities. And all of these seem to be founded in misinformation. The whole attitude seems to allow members of the far right to be so convinced of their own oppression that they fail to consider that they're oppressing other people. So that's really the conclusion that I've came to, that there's a large difference between the way that historical and current far right groups present themselves, despite having similar belief systems. This also reflects onto how they feel about themselves and what they're doing. I'm sure a lot of people will question why I would choose to study this kind of grim area, but I just think it's really important as a society that we understand why people have these extreme views and what is really going on there, so that we can talk to people in a way that they will listen and be able to correct or educate against misinformation. So at the end, I've put my image references and also just the references that I directly referenced in my talk today, but the actual paper has much more references that wouldn't fit on. So if you want to look at them, you need to look at the paper.